Welcome to your daily news deep dive. Today we'll be navigating a sea of headlines about climate change, extreme weather, and some serious political shifts that are reshaping the energy landscape. We'll be covering a lot of ground today, from the aftermath of those devastating Los Angeles wildfires to melting ice in Antarctica.
We're going to try to unpack the complex interplay of factors at work here.
Yeah, it's always a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Exactly. We'll cover everything from the climate science to the policy decisions and try to highlight some of the key questions that you should be asking as you process all this information.
Sounds good. To start, let's take a closer look at those Los Angeles wildfires. Those images of the firestorm just ripping through neighborhoods were horrifying. And the scale of destruction is unprecedented.
Truly unprecedented. 50,000 acres scorched, 28 lives lost, and a staggering 16,000 structures just reduced to ashes.
It's hard to even fathom that level of devastation.
And it's already being called the costliest wildfire in world history. The financial repercussions will be felt for years to come.
I can only imagine. But beyond the immediate devastation, it's crucial to understand how climate change is actually exacerbating these events. Scientists estimate that the extreme drought fueling these fires was 35% more likely because of human-caused climate change.
That's right. Essentially, climate change is adding 23 more fire-prone days to Southern California's calendar each year.
So it's not just a question of if but when these fires will happen.
Exactly. And that raises the question of whether we're adequately prepared for this new reality of more frequent and intense wildfires.
It's a sobering thought for sure. We also need to think about how climate change interacts with these regional weather patterns, like those Santa Ana winds that rapidly spread those flames.
Right. While the Santa Ana winds themselves aren't directly caused by climate change, the increasing severity of droughts creates what scientists call weather whiplash.
I've heard that term. What exactly does it mean?
It basically refers to these extreme swings between periods of intense rainfall and prolonged droughts.
So the heavy rains cause a ton of vegetation to grow, but then the droughts turn all that vegetation into tinder.
Precisely. And when the Santa Ana winds kick up, as they inevitably do, the fire risk is significantly higher because of this abundance of dry fuel.
It's like a recipe for disaster. And speaking of disaster, we can't forget about the residents who are now facing the daunting task of rebuilding their lives amid the ashes.
It's heartbreaking. They're dealing with hazardous waste cleanup, toxic air quality, and the psychological trauma of displacement and loss.
And it's going to be a long and difficult road to recovery for them.
Absolutely. This situation raises complex questions about where and how we rebuild in an era of increasingly frequent and severe wildfires.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to make those kinds of decisions after losing everything.
It's an incredibly difficult situation. Some experts are advocating for stricter building codes and fire prevention measures,
Which makes sense.
while others are calling for managed retreat from fire-prone areas.
That seems like a pretty drastic solution.
It is, but it's a conversation we need to be having given the increasing risks.
Definitely. And on top of all this, there's also the issue of who should shoulder the financial burden of these disasters. Southern California Edison is actually trying to raise rates to cover the $7 billion in damages from previous fires linked to their equipment.
That's right. Which raises the crucial question of responsibility and accountability.
Should utility companies be held liable for damages caused by their infrastructure? Especially when you consider that climate change is increasing the likelihood of these events.
It's a valid question. Should those costs be passed on to consumers? These are tough questions with no easy answers.
For sure. Speaking of difficult questions, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another story that's been dominating the headlines. Donald Trump's return to the White House and the immediate shift in climate policy.
It feels like stepping back in time, seeing those executive orders rolling back environmental regulations and promoting fossil fuels.
Yeah, in his first week back, Trump has withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, halted funding for Biden's ambitious climate law, and declared a national energy emergency focused on expanding oil and gas production.
It's a complete reversal of the previous administration's climate agenda, and it has far-reaching implications not just for the U.S., but for global climate action.
It's definitely a concerning shift. He's also targeting fuel economy standards, pushing to open up the Arctic for drilling, and essentially putting the brakes on electric vehicle goals.
It feels like a full-fledged return to fossil fuel dependence at a time when scientists are warning us that we need to rapidly transition to clean energy.
It seems like a pretty stark disconnect between the science and the policy.
It is, and it's already facing pushback from states' environmental groups and even some members of his own party who recognize the economic and environmental benefits of clean energy.
Hopefully that pushback can gain some traction. A federal judge has already issued a temporary block on his order to freeze funding for Biden's climate law.
That's a small victory, but legal battles over executive authority and the future of climate action are certain to continue.
It feels like we're entering a period of heightened uncertainty and political polarization around this issue.
Absolutely. And all of this is playing out against a backdrop of increasingly alarming climate news from around the world. Scientists have just released a landmark study analyzing 30 years of data on landfast sea ice thickness in Antarctica's McMurdo Sound.
Antarctica is often seen as this remote and isolated continent, but what happens there has implications for the entire planet.
Exactly. This data is providing crucial insights into the long-term impacts of climate change on this vulnerable region.
So what are the scientists finding? Is the ice thinning as we might expect with a warming climate?
While the full analysis is still ongoing, having this comprehensive data set is incredibly valuable.
It's like a window into the past.
Right. It can help us project how the Antarctic ice sheet might respond to future warming, which of course has significant implications for global sea levels.
It's a stark reminder that climate change is not just a future threat. It's a present reality with tangible consequences that are unfolding right now.
Couldn't agree more. And the news isn't limited to Antarctica. New Zealand is facing sharp criticism for its climate plan, which many are calling inadequate and out of step with the urgency of the crisis.
Their goal of reducing emissions by a mere 1% between 2030 and 2035 is being labeled pathetic by critics.
It's a far cry from the ambitious emissions reductions targets that scientists say are necessary to prevent catastrophic warming.
Seems like some countries are still dragging their feet when it comes to taking meaningful action on climate change.
It's unfortunate. Meanwhile, African leaders are facing a completely different set of challenges as they strive to achieve their energy goals.
What kind of challenges are they facing?
They're grappling with outdated and unreliable grid infrastructure, which is a major barrier to expanding access to electricity and integrating renewable energy sources.
So it's not just about building new renewable energy projects. It's also about modernizing the infrastructure to actually deliver that energy.
Precisely. Many African nations are looking to attract investments in grid modernization and expansion, but it's a complex and costly undertaking.
I can imagine. So it's not just about throwing money at the problem.
Right. It's about strategic investment and a multi-pronged approach.
I see. Are there other approaches being considered?
There's a growing interest in off-grid solutions like solar mini-grids, which can provide electricity to remote communities that aren't connected to the main grid.
That's interesting. So they're basically creating these self-contained energy systems.
Exactly. And these mini-grids can be powered by renewable energy, offering a clean and sustainable way to bring electricity to those who need it most.
That sounds promising.
Yeah.
It's a way to both expand access to electricity and promote clean energy development.
Exactly. And speaking of promising developments, a World Bank-backed project is aiming to bring electricity access to a whopping 300 million people in Africa by 2030.
That's an ambitious goal.
It is, but certainly achievable with the right investments and policy support.
It would be a game changer for these communities. The benefits extend far beyond just turning on the lights. Access to electricity is a fundamental driver of economic development.
Absolutely. It enables businesses to thrive, creates jobs, and improves people's quality of life.
It's also crucial for healthcare education and communication.
Couldn't agree more.
Huh.
And while we're talking about global energy and climate news, we can't overlook the incredible strides China is making in renewable energy.
They've just smashed their 2030 renewable energy target, a full 6 years ahead of schedule.
That's right. They installed a record-breaking 357 gigawatts of wind and solar power in 2024 alone.
Wow, that's impressive. It demonstrates that rapid progress on clean energy is possible.
It certainly does. But there's a catch.
You're still heavily reliant on coal, right?
Unfortunately, yes. That's the paradox of China's energy landscape. While they're leading the world in renewable energy deployment, they're also the biggest consumer and producer of coal, which is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel.
So it's a mixed bag. Progress on one hand, but challenges on the other.
It highlights the need for a nuanced understanding of these global energy transitions. It's not always a straightforward linear progression.
Definitely. And speaking of nuanced understandings, the legal battle over who's responsible for the costs of climate change is heating up in California.
Right. A proposed law is seeking to hold oil and gas companies financially accountable for climate change-related disasters.
This is a bold move. It's essentially saying you created the mess.
Yeah.
You helped clean it up.
It's based on the principle that the companies that have profited from the extraction and sale of fossil fuels, knowing the risks they pose to the climate, should share in the costs of addressing the impacts of those risks.
Makes sense. but it's going to be a tough fight.
For sure, it's a major test case that could have implications for other states and even other countries.
Definitely. And this isn't the only legal battle brewing in the climate arena. There were some unsettling allegations involving ExxonMobil and a lobbying firm called DCI Group.
Right. They've been linked to a hacking case targeting climate activists.
That sounds pretty shady.
It is. According to investigations, hackers allegedly stole confidential information from activists involved in lawsuits against Exxon.
And that information was then used by Exxon in their legal defense.
Exactly. If these allegations are proven true, it would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the principles of a fair and impartial legal system.
It's a stark reminder that the fight over climate change is high stakes, and some powerful actors are willing to use any means necessary to protect their interests.
Couldn't agree more. And while these legal battles are unfolding in courtrooms, another fight is brewing on the ground in Nevada. Activists are pushing back against a proposed lithium mine near Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge.
I've heard about this. This refuge is a biodiversity hotspot home to dozens of endangered species.
It is. This situation really highlights the complexities of the clean energy transition.
Yeah, because lithium is an essential component of batteries used in electric vehicles and renewable energy storage.
Exactly. So it's considered a critical mineral for the clean energy transition.
But extracting lithium often involves open pit mining, which can have significant environmental impacts.
Right. Habitat destruction, water contamination, and ecosystem disruption.
So it's a classic dilemma, trying to balance the need for clean energy technologies with the potential environmental consequences of those technologies.
Absolutely. And in this case, the stakes are particularly high because Ash Meadows is such a unique and fragile ecosystem.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Indeed. And to complicate matters further, the Biden administration had actually issued a temporary mining ban near Ash Meadows.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
But with the recent political changes, the future of that ban and the mine itself is uncertain.
So it's another example of how politics can impact even seemingly local environmental issues.
Precisely.
Huh.
And speaking of local environmental issues, communities in Vermont are facing a different kind of climate challenge. Increasingly severe flooding.
It seems like every year we hear about record rainfall and devastating floods in the Northeast.
Vermont has seen a dramatic increase in extreme precipitation events in recent years, which is unfortunately consistent with climate change projections.
So these intense storms are overwhelming rivers and streams, causing widespread flooding.
That's right.
And it's not just the immediate physical damage. There's also the long-term challenge of rebuilding and adapting, knowing that the next flood could be just around the corner.
I can only imagine. How are these communities coping with this escalating threat?
They're taking a multifaceted approach, recognizing that there's no single silver bullet solution. They're restoring floodplains to absorb excess water, strengthening infrastructure to withstand stronger storms, and in some cases making the difficult decision to buy out at-risk homes.
That last option, buying out homes, must be heartbreaking for families who have lived in these communities for generations.
It is, but it's also a recognition that we can't simply keep rebuilding in the same vulnerable areas.
We need to be smarter about how and where we develop.
And we need to prioritize resilience in the face of these increasing climate risks.
Absolutely. But resilience looks different in different places. For example, Kentucky is taking a rather innovative approach to relocating flood survivors.
How?
They're building new housing developments on reclaimed coal mining sites. That's fascinating. I know eastern Kentucky was hit hard by severe flooding back in 2022.
And the region is also grappling with the decline of the coal industry, which has left behind these vast tracts of scarred and unusable land.
So this project is aiming to address both of those problems at once.
Precisely. It's a creative solution that seeks to provide safe and affordable housing for flood survivors, while also putting those former mining sites to productive use.
That's a great idea. How many families are they hoping to relocate?
The new developments are designed to support over 600 families, and they feature energy-efficient homes powered by solar panels.
That's a nice touch. It sounds like a win-win situation.
It does, but I imagine there are challenges as well.
Of course. What kind of challenges?
Well, construction costs are high, and federal funding has been delayed because of that funding freeze we discussed earlier.
Yes, that makes sense. And are people on board with the idea of relocating?
Some residents are understandably reluctant to leave their ancestral lands, even if it means facing greater flood risks in the future.
That's understandable. It's a reminder that climate adaptation isn't just about engineering and infrastructure. It's also about people, their cultural ties to place, and their sense of identity.
It requires sensitivity and understanding.
It's about finding solutions that work for both people and the planet. and that requires a holistic approach.
Couldn't agree more. Well, while Kentucky grapples with these complex relocation efforts, scientists are engaged in a heated debate over whether a key Atlantic Ocean current is weakening.
This is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short.
Right, I've heard about this.
Yeah.
It plays a crucial role in regulating global climate.
Exactly. The AMOC is a massive system of ocean currents that transports warm water from the tropics northward and cold water southward. It's often described as a giant conveyor belt that helps to distribute heat around the globe.
And it influences weather patterns, particularly in Europe and North America.
Precisely. So any disruption to this system could have significant consequences.
And there have been studies suggesting that the AMOC is slowing down, possibly due to climate change.
That's right. Which has sparked a lot of concern. But now a new study is challenging those earlier findings.
Oh, really?
Yes. This new study used more sophisticated computer models and a more comprehensive data set to reconstruct AMOC behavior over the past 60 years.
Interesting. And what did they find?
They found no evidence of long-term weakening over that period.
Huh. So maybe we can breathe a sigh of relief.
Not quite. The authors are very clear that it doesn't mean it will stay that way in the future. They acknowledge that the AMOC remains vulnerable to future warming, and continued monitoring is essential to understand how it's evolving.
So they're not ruling out the possibility that climate change could still disrupt the AMOC in the future.
Absolutely not. The potential consequences of a significant AMOC slowdown are so far-reaching that we need to remain vigilant.
It would impact everything from weather patterns to agricultural productivity to sea level rise.
Exactly. It's another piece of the puzzle that we need to consider as we grapple with the complex and interconnected challenges of climate change.
Well, while scientists continue to study these global systems, cities like New York are grappling with more localized climate challenges.
Like what?
New York City is currently facing some unintended consequences of its new congestion pricing program, which aims to reduce traffic in Manhattan by charging a toll for vehicles entering the central business district.
It's a well-intentioned policy designed to alleviate traffic congestion, reduce air pollution, and generate revenue for public transportation improvements.
Less traffic in Manhattan means less noise, cleaner air, and hopefully a more pleasant experience for pedestrians and cyclists.
Right. But it seems like the program is having some unintended consequences in neighboring boroughs.
Like what?
Traffic doesn't just disappear, it gets diverted.
Right, of course.
And in this case, some of that diverted traffic is ending up in lower-income neighborhoods like the South Bronx, which are already burdened with higher asthma rates and poor air quality.
So while congestion pricing may be beneficial for Manhattan, it's raising serious environmental justice concerns in these surrounding communities.
It's a classic example of how even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, especially if they're not implemented with a careful consideration of equity and social justice.
It highlights the importance of community engagement and thoughtful planning.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that the benefits of these programs are shared equitably and that the burdens don't fall disproportionately on those who are already most vulnerable.
A very important point. It's a lesson that applies to many aspects of climate policy and action.
Agreed. We need to be mindful of the potential distributional impacts of our choices and ensure that we're creating solutions that work for everyone.
Well said.
And speaking of justice, there's a class action lawsuit that's been filed against Marathon Petroleum.
Oh, what's that about?
They're being accused of downplaying the health and environmental impacts of a massive refinery fire that occurred in Louisiana back in 2023.
This fire happened in an area known as Cancer Alley, right?
That's right, a stretch of land along the Mississippi River that's home to a dense concentration of petrochemical plants and refineries.
It's a region that's already overburdened with industrial pollution and its associated health risks.
It is, and the fire at the Marathon refinery burned for 3 days, releasing a toxic cloud of chemicals into the surrounding communities.
That's awful.
Investigations revealed that residents were exposed to dangerously high levels of benzene, far exceeding the CDC's safety thresholds.
And benzene is a known carcinogen.
Exactly. And despite this, the company initially downplayed the incident, claiming that there were no off-site impacts.
Wow, so now residents are suing.
They're seeking over $5 million in damages. They're demanding that Marathon be held accountable for its alleged negligence and lack of transparency.
This lawsuit underscores the very real human consequences of industrial accidents.
And the importance of corporate accountability when it comes to protecting public health and the environment.
It's a reminder that the fight for environmental justice is often a fight against powerful corporations that prioritize profit over the well-being of communities.
And it highlights the importance of strong environmental regulations, rigorous enforcement, and access to legal recourse for those who are harmed by industrial pollution.
Well said. While that legal battle plays out, let's turn our attention to another region facing the impacts of climate change: Europe. A new study has projected that hotter summers could kill millions in Europe by 2100.
That's right, if we don't take significant action to reduce emissions and adapt to a warming world.
These findings are based on advanced climate simulations.
And they show a dramatic increase in heat-related deaths, particularly in southern Europe, as temperatures continue to rise.
Countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece are projected to be hit the hardest.
The study also predicts that even under optimistic climate scenarios, the number of heat-related deaths will far outpace any decrease in cold-related deaths.
That's alarming. It underscores the urgency of addressing climate change and the very real threat it poses to human health and well-being.
We need to be prepared for a future with more extreme heat events.
And it's not just the physical impacts we need to worry about. The mental health consequences of climate disasters are often overlooked, but equally significant.
Very true. We're seeing this play out right now in Los Angeles, where residents are still struggling with the emotional fallout of those devastating wildfires.
The trauma, anxiety, and grief associated with such events can be profound and long-lasting.
It's not just those who lost their homes or loved ones who are affected. Even those who weren't directly impacted can experience what therapists call dysregulation.
Which is basically a state of heightened stress and emotional instability.
Right. It makes it difficult to cope with everyday life.
It's crucial to recognize that the psychological impacts of climate change are just as real and just as significant as the physical impacts.
Absolutely. We need to provide adequate support and resources to help people cope with the emotional toll of these events.
And we need to acknowledge that these mental health impacts will only worsen as climate change intensifies.
We need to be prepared to provide long-term mental health care for those affected by climate disasters and build more resilient communities that can better support each other in times of crisis.
It's a reminder that climate action is not just about reducing emissions or adapting to physical risks. It's also about caring for the well-being of people and communities.
It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our physical, mental, and social well-being and creating a future that is not only sustainable, but also just and compassionate.
Well said. And while we're on the topic of compassion and global solidarity, there's some good news coming out of Africa. That World Bank-backed project we mentioned earlier, the one aiming to bring electricity access to 300 million people across the continent by 2030, is making significant progress.
That's fantastic. It's a testament to what's possible when we combine financial resources, technological innovation, and a commitment to equitable development.
It's not just about bringing light to homes and businesses. It's about empowering communities, improving health outcomes, expanding educational opportunities, and unlocking economic potential.
It's a powerful reminder that even amidst the challenges of climate change, we can still make progress towards a more just and sustainable future.
Absolutely. And speaking of progress, scientists have made a fascinating discovery about the role that microbes play in detoxifying our atmosphere.
It turns out that certain microbes play a crucial role in consuming vast amounts of carbon monoxide.
Which is a harmful gas produced by various human activities.
Exactly. This research highlights the intricate ways in which the natural world works to maintain a healthy planet.
It's a reminder that we're part of a complex web of life, and we need to be doing everything we can to protect biodiversity and the ecosystems that support all life on Earth.
We can learn so much from nature and its amazing ability to heal and regenerate.
It's about shifting our perspective from seeing ourselves as separate from nature to recognizing that we are inextricably linked to it.
Our well-being depends on the health of the planet, and the health of the planet depends on our choices and actions.
Powerful words. We'll leave our listeners to ponder that thought as we wrap up part one of our deep dive into today's news.
We've covered a lot of ground, from wildfires and political turmoil to scientific discoveries and glimmers of hope. Welcome back to our deep dive into today's top news stories. We're picking up where we left off, exploring the interconnected challenges and potential solutions that are shaping our world.
And speaking of interconnected challenges, we have to talk about the doomsday clock. It just moved 1 second closer to midnight, folks.
That's right. It now stands at a sobering 89 seconds to midnight. This symbolic clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, serves as a stark reminder of the existential threats we face as a species.
For those who might not be familiar with the doomsday clock, it's essentially a visual representation of how close we are to global catastrophe, with midnight symbolizing the end of civilization. And the fact that it's moved closer to midnight is definitely cause for concern. What are the main factors pushing us closer to the brink?
The bulletin cites climate change as a primary threat alongside nuclear war and the misuse of artificial intelligence. They argue that we're not doing nearly enough to address these interconnected crises and that our inaction is pushing us closer to the precipice. It's a wake-up call we can't afford to ignore.
Definitely a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the choices we make today will have profound consequences for generations to come. We have a responsibility to act decisively and collectively to mitigate these risks and create a safer, more sustainable future.
And speaking of the future, we need to talk about the growing issue of climate migration. As climate change intensifies, we're seeing more and more people displaced from their homes due to rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and other climate-related impacts.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. We're seeing this play out in places like Kentucky, where flood survivors are being relocated to new communities built on former strip mines. It's a creative solution, but also raises questions about whether it's better to rebuild in vulnerable areas or relocate to safer ground. What factors should communities consider when making these difficult decisions?
There's no one-size-fits-all answer. Each community has its own unique circumstances, and the decision to relocate or rebuild depends on a complex interplay of factors, including economic realities, cultural ties to place, and the availability of suitable relocation sites. It's essential to involve the affected communities in these decisions and ensure that their voices are heard and their needs are met.
And it's not just about physical relocation. It's also about providing economic opportunities, social support, and access to essential services for those who are forced to move out. Climate migration is a multifaceted challenge that requires a holistic approach.
Absolutely. And speaking of multifaceted challenges, New York City's congestion pricing program, while aimed at reducing traffic congestion in Manhattan, is inadvertently raising concerns about equity and environmental justice.
We touched on this earlier, but it's worth revisiting. The idea of congestion pricing, charging a toll for vehicles entering certain areas, is to discourage driving and encourage the use of public transportation, walking, and cycling. In theory, it's a good way to reduce traffic congestion, air pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. But in practice, it can have unintended consequences, particularly for lower-income communities.
That's right. When you implement congestion pricing, traffic often gets diverted to surrounding areas, potentially increasing congestion and pollution in neighborhoods that are already disproportionately burdened with environmental hazards. In the case of New York City, some of that diverted traffic is ending up in the South Bronx, a community that already suffers from high rates of asthma and other respiratory problems.
So it's a classic example of how a well-intentioned policy can have negative consequences if it's not implemented in a way that considers the broader social and environmental context.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of incorporating equity considerations into climate policy and ensuring that the benefits of such programs are distributed fairly and that the burdens don't fall disproportionately on those who are least able to bear them. We need to be mindful of these unintended consequences and strive to create solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Well said. And speaking of unintended consequences, Trump's decision to roll back fuel economy standards is being met with mixed reactions, with some arguing that it will lower the cost of vehicles and boost the economy, while others warn that it will lead to increased fuel consumption and higher emissions. It's a decision that seems to prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability.
It's a classic example of the tension between economic growth and environmental protection. And in this case, it seems like the administration is prioritizing the former at the expense of the latter. The rollback of fuel economy standards is a step backward in our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. It sends the wrong signal to the auto industry and to the world. It's also a missed opportunity. The auto industry is already moving towards electric vehicles and other cleaner technologies, driven by consumer demand and market forces. By rolling back these standards, the administration is essentially undermining this progress and clinging to outdated technologies that are harmful to the environment and to public health.
It's a short-sighted policy that ignores the long-term costs of climate change and the economic benefits of a clean energy transition. We need to be investing in the future, not clinging to the past.
And while the U.S. takes a step backward, China continues to move forward with its ambitious renewable energy goals. As we discussed earlier, China has already surpassed its 2030 renewable energy target, demonstrating that rapid progress is possible.
China's success in deploying wind and solar power is a testament to its commitment to clean energy and its ability to implement large-scale infrastructure projects quickly and efficiently. It's a model that other countries can learn from as they strive to transition to a cleaner energy future. But it's important to remember that China is still heavily reliant on coal, which is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel. So it's a complex picture of progress and challenges.
Exactly. China's energy landscape is a microcosm of the global energy transition, a mix of old and new technologies, competing interests, and a complex interplay of economic, environmental, and political factors. It's a reminder that there's no single solution to the climate crisis. We need a multifaceted approach that includes reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, investing in renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and promoting sustainable consumption patterns.
And that brings us back to the political battle over climate policy. Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement and roll back environmental regulations is a major setback for global climate action.
It's a decision that has been widely condemned by scientists, world leaders, and even some members of Trump's own party. The scientific consensus on climate change is overwhelming, and the evidence of its impacts is all around us. We can't afford to ignore this crisis or delay action any longer.
It's disheartening to see the U.S., which has historically been a leader in climate action, taking such a regressive stance. But it's also a reminder that political will is a fragile thing, and that progress on climate change is not inevitable. We need to keep fighting for policies that promote a clean and sustainable future.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable for their actions. Climate change is not a partisan issue, it's an issue that affects us all. We need to work together across party lines to find solutions that protect our planet and ensure a healthy and prosperous future for all.
Well said. And while the political battles rage on, scientists continue to make important discoveries about our changing planet. One recent study has found that sea levels were several meters higher than today during the mid-Holocene period, when carbon dioxide levels were similar to pre-industrial times.
This finding is significant because it suggests that even relatively small increases in atmospheric CO2 can have substantial long-term impacts on sea levels. It's a reminder that the climate system is incredibly complex and sensitive to changes in greenhouse gas concentrations.
And it underscores the importance of reducing our emissions as quickly as possible to avoid triggering irreversible changes in the climate system. We're already seeing the effects of sea level rise in coastal communities around the world, and these impacts will only worsen as the planet continues to warm.
Sea level rise is one of the most significant threats posed by climate change. It has the potential to displace millions of people, inundate coastal infrastructure, and disrupt ecosystems. We need to take this threat seriously and invest in adaptation measures that can help protect coastal communities from the worst impacts of rising seas.
And it's not just sea level rise we need to be concerned about. Climate change is also intensifying extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, and heat waves. We're seeing the effects of these events all over the world, from the devastating wildfires in Australia to the record-breaking floods in Europe.
These extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense as the planet warms, and they're having a devastating impact on human lives, property, and ecosystems. We need to invest in resilience measures that can help communities prepare for and recover from these disasters.
And we need to reduce our emissions to prevent these events from becoming even more severe in the future. The longer we wait, the more difficult and costly it will be to address the climate crisis. But amidst all the doom and gloom, there are also signs of hope. Communities around the world are taking action to address climate change, from implementing renewable energy projects to restoring ecosystems to promoting sustainable agriculture.
These grassroots efforts are essential for building a more sustainable future. They demonstrate that change is possible and that people are willing to take action to protect their communities and their planet.
It's inspiring to see these efforts happening at the local level, even in the face of national and international inaction. It gives me hope that we can overcome this challenge and create a better future for all.
These grassroots efforts are not only inspiring, they're also essential for building momentum for larger-scale change. They show policymakers and businesses that people are demanding action on climate change, and they create a groundswell of support for policies that promote a cleaner and more sustainable future.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in addressing the climate crisis. Whether it's reducing our own carbon footprints, supporting businesses that are committed to sustainability, or advocating for policy change, we can all make a difference.
Every action counts. The climate crisis is a complex and multifaceted challenge, but it's not insurmountable. By working together, we can create a more sustainable and just future for all.
Well said. And speaking of working together, we need to talk about the importance of international cooperation in addressing the climate crisis. No single country can solve this problem alone. We need a global effort to reduce emissions, adapt to the impacts of climate change, and build a more sustainable future.
The Paris Agreement, despite the U.S.'s withdrawal, remains a landmark achievement in international climate diplomacy. It provides a framework for global cooperation on climate change and sets ambitious goals for reducing emissions and limiting global warming. While the agreement has its limitations, it's a crucial step in the right direction.
It's encouraging to see that many countries, including China and the European Union, are committed to meeting their Paris Agreement targets. But more needs to be done. We need to strengthen the agreement, increase ambition, and ensure that all countries, including the U.S., are playing their part.
And we need to ensure that developing countries have the financial and technological resources they need to transition to clean energy and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Climate justice requires that those who have contributed the least to the problem are not left to bear the brunt of its consequences.
That's a crucial point. Climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's also a social justice issue. The impacts of climate change are felt most acutely by those who are least able to cope, including low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities.
And these communities are often the ones who have contributed the least to the problem. It's essential that we address climate change in a way that is just and equitable, ensuring that the benefits of climate action are shared widely, and that the burdens are not disproportionately borne by those who are already most vulnerable.
Well, while we work towards a more just and sustainable future, let's take a moment to appreciate some of the amazing adaptations that nature has developed to cope with the challenges of a changing world. For example, did you know that polar bears stay warm in frigid Arctic conditions thanks to their greasy hair?
It may sound strange, but the sebum, or oil in polar bear fur, acts as a natural anti-icing agent, preventing ice from forming and building up on their fur. It's a brilliant adaptation that allows them to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth.
It's a reminder that nature is full of surprises and that we can learn a lot from the adaptations of other species as we face the challenges of a changing climate.
Biomimicry, the practice of learning from and imitating nature's designs and processes, is a growing field that holds immense potential for developing innovative solutions to human challenges. From energy-efficient buildings inspired by termite mounds to self-healing materials modeled after the skin of a chameleon, nature is a rich source of inspiration for innovation.
It's a reminder that we're part of nature, not separate from it. And by studying and learning from the natural world, we can develop solutions that are not only effective, but also sustainable and harmonious with the planet.
It's about shifting our mindset from one of domination and control to one of respect and collaboration. By working with nature rather than against it, we can create a more resilient and thriving future for all.
Well said. And on that note, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into today's news, exploring the latest developments in climate science policy and action. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those devastating LA wildfires to melting ice in Antarctica to Trump's return to the White House. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the climate crisis.
It is. It's a complex, multifaceted problem with no easy solutions.
But it's important to remember that there's still hope. There are things we can do both individually and collectively to address this challenge and create a more sustainable future.
Absolutely. We're seeing signs of progress all over the world, from communities rebuilding after disasters to technological innovations aimed at reducing our impact.
We've seen those glimmers of hope, even in today's news, haven't we?
We have, from the scientists studying the AMOC to those working to bring electricity to millions in Africa, there are people all over the planet working tirelessly to address this crisis.
It's inspiring to see those efforts. And it's not just scientists and policymakers. It's everyday people making changes in their lives to reduce their footprint.
That's right. It's the grassroots movements demanding action, the businesses investing in sustainable solutions, the young people leading the charge for a better future.
All those individual actions add up to a collective momentum for change.
And that momentum is building, even in the face of political setbacks and the daunting scale of the problem.
It feels like we're reaching a tipping point where the collective will to address climate change is starting to outweigh the inertia of the status quo.
And that's a powerful thing. It can drive innovation, inspire creativity, and lead to the transformative changes we need to create a truly sustainable future.
But we can't let up.
Yeah.
We have to keep pushing for change.
Exactly. The window of opportunity is closing. We have to accelerate our efforts to reduce emissions, adapt to the impacts that are already happening, and build a more resilient future.
So what can we do as individuals? What are some concrete steps we can take to contribute to this collective effort?
Well, first and foremost, we need to stay informed about the issue.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we understand the science, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions and advocate for meaningful change.
And we can reduce our own carbon footprint.
Make conscious choices about what you buy, how you travel, how you use energy.
Every little bit helps.
Support businesses that are committed to sustainability. Vote for leaders who prioritize climate action.
Get involved in local initiatives to promote environmental stewardship.
Speak up about the issue. Talk to your friends, family, and colleagues about the importance of climate action.
Don't underestimate the power of your voice.
If enough people demand change, our leaders will have to listen.
And that's what it's going to take. Collective action is the only way we're going to solve this.
We're all in this together.
Well said. We've explored the depths of the climate crisis today, but we've also seen those glimmers of hope, the signs of progress, the examples of resilience and ingenuity.
That's what we need to focus on. The possibility of a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful.
The future is not yet written. We all have a role to play in shaping it.
That's it for the Deep Dive today. We'll be back tomorrow with more news and analysis, helping you navigate the complexities of our changing world.
Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.